Hello, America. The sponsor of this video is my buddy Jane, who wanted to know more about saws. So, the two basic saws that you're going to have for most woodworking is a table saw and a miter saw. Table saw being used primarily for what they call rip cuts. So, if you have a board, a rip cut is you have the length of the board is making that thinner. It's cutting parallel to the length of your board like this. So it's really nice that you can set your fence and you can push this board all the way through. If you need to trim off an inch, cut this in half, something like this to a long, narrow piece. So kind of parallel to the length of the piece. There's no front and back on a table saw, so it's really good for long pieces of wood. You can do 8 feet, 6 feet, 10 feet. If you have some board, 2x4, something like that, and you need to rip them down by the width, you can put a very long piece of wood through there. And it's stable. The saw is stable, and you're moving the piece of wood. The second primary form of saw is your miter saw. Miter being a perpendicular cut to the length of the wood. So this being the wood stays stationary and your saw moves in one direction like that. So you can do something like this on a table saw, right? Most table saws come with what they call a miter block that fixes your angle perpendicularly. You don't have to do 90, right? Both of these allow you to change the angle, so if you need to do any kind of angle curve, you can. But that fixes your axis so you can push pieces through. It gets a little trickier because you're only supporting it at one spot, and you are able to do very small pieces, stuff like that, right? Like obviously you're set by this distance from the blade. So if you need something a little bit smaller, it can be a little tricky, and you can clamp to here. This works. I've never used this thing, but they're very common, and a lot of saws come with them. So, what people do instead, and what I did, is when you make a cross-cut sled like this, right? So a cross-cut sled allows me to make cross cuts, being perpendicular cuts, being miter cuts, on a table saw. So now, this supports the entire length of my board as I push it across the saw, which again, nothing's kind of clamped down, and my saw's not adjusted, but okay. I'm snagging on something. Anyway, sorry, this entire thing's on wheels. It keeps moving when I'm trying to talk. Okay. So the advantage of having a miter, a crosscut sled, is one, you can do a fence like this. You can set whatever your 12 inches, your distance from your blade, and that's really the advantage of all your fixed big saws, is the ability to nail down angles and do reproducibility with stop blocks. Because you can do all this stuff. You can make all your cuts on a table saw mostly with a circular saw. It's the same thing. This is just fixed upside down in a table. So make sure with a fence that you're always parallel to the blade, getting straight cuts. And your fence has a measuring guide, and mine is toned in very precisely, so I'm not having to measure every piece of wood. So I need to rip 10 of these. You just got to do your measurements and set your stop block up once right. You can do a couple test cuts, and then you can throw all 10 pieces of wood through very quickly with better dust collection, with better accuracy, and better reproducibility. You obviously can't do very small pieces. Like, it'd be very tricky to cut something like this. Because you don't really have a lot of places to clamp down or hold it. I still use this all the time For large sheets, if you have a 4x8 piece of plywood, which is a standard size, and you need to cut into that, it'd be almost impossible for me as one person to move 4 feet by 8 feet chunk of board accurately across this saw. People do it, but they have larger industrial size saws, table saws, that look more like tables. This is a job site table saw, and it's very small. It does great for my purposes, using it ad hoc. But what people will do is they have large ones that actually have a table that is actually, 4 feet by 8 feet, something like that. Or they'll take something like this and they'll build it into a workbench so you have the supports around it, allowing you to do larger pieces of boards with better support and better fences and stuff like that. I do use my workbenches as in-feet, out-feet for this. So if I do normally like 2x4, something like that, if I have something that's 8 feet, 10 feet long, I'll still support it on either ends to increase the table size, but I'm still not going to push a giant sheet of plywood through. You can kind of do that if you have a second pair of hands, but I just clamp down the board for something that's that much larger. It's easier to keep the board stationary and move the saw. But for smaller things, it's a lot easier to keep the saw stationary and move the wood. So why do I make a crosscut sled? Because if you can use the table saw to replicate a miter saw, can you use a miter saw to replicate a table saw? So this thing is fantastic that you do the same thing. You can set a stop block. So if you have a bunch of consistent cuts, you set your stop block, you clamp that down, and you can just churn out a dozen cuts in no time at all. Like, you just measure once, cut a dozen times. The only problem with this is my setup. For me, I don't have a stop block. I have a stop block. I don't have a measuring stop block. Like for this right now, it's really easy to set the distance. I have a little, I made this that has my measurements and my ruler already built into it, measure from the blade. And I also have these clamps in here. So this is really nice too. I have very, very small things that I'm trying to do a miter cut on. I feel a lot safer clamping the pieces into the board and being able to push that through with my fingers well away from the blade versus holding my fingers close to the blade here. There's not a good way for me, with the way this is set up, to clamp small stuff. So I still use it for larger boards, but if I need to do a miter cut on something that's very small and precise or very thin, I actually do feel better using the crosscut sled on the table saw. I have sometimes when I'm lazy, because this is a pretty safe tool, right? As far as all powered saws are, your piece is supported on the bottom and behind it. So as your blade is rotating this way, all the force is going down and back, and it's very well supported. You're just moving it one direction here. The table saw has a potential for kickback. As the blade's going this way and you're pushing your piece, it could send the piece flying behind you. So they have kickback feet to kind of like lash into the wood to prevent that from happening. There are safety features built in, and I've never ran into that. Technique, safety, there are ways to mitigate that, but I will sometimes when I want to drag this out, or I have one saw out already, you can cut, if you need to do a rip cut, that way. But the problem is you have the size difference. Because the saw is fixed, you're limited on how size of the board, right? So you can only get about 12 inches cutting a rip that way. And you can cheat and flip the piece over. I've done it. It's possible. It's not very good. You really want to use a table saw for something like that. If you need to in a jam, you can do larger cuts like that, larger than this 12 inches if you have a larger board, just by flipping it over and doing it in a couple different cuts. But mainly, this is a sliding miter saw. So instead of having your cut distance just be this diameter of the blade here, you can push down and you slide it back. Again, it's rockety because I don't have anything clamped down. Nothing's plugged in. This is just a demo video. But normally everything's a little bit more stable, even though the floor isn't level. So this is a compound miter saw. Compound meaning you can adjust it along two axes. So this is 90, 0 degrees. You can also do like 22.5. You can do 45, which I've done a lot. So that your wood staying in the same spot allows you to do a 45-degree angle there. And you can also bevel it by adjusting this here. That tilts this way. I'm not going to do it just because I don't want to. But use your imagination. If you need to have a piece with a slant there, you can tilt the blade this way. And you can do both at the same time. So you can adjust your angle and your bevel, and that's why it's a compound miter saw. Instead of taking your piece and cutting it twice, once with the angle, once with the bevel, you can compound, do both of those things at once. And this one has a little measurement laser, which is really nice, because you can mark your piece of wood, I measure it, and then I'll just line up that laser. I figured out where it sits, right on that line, and then clamp down my stop block, and that's how I tune this in. A lot of people that have a dedicated miter station, they'll build something like this, where they have a ruler with a stop block, and they can measure more accurately, because the saw is always in a fixed position, so they can measure the distance from your blade here. So these are your two kind of essential saws that most wood shops would have. Table saw and miter saw for rip cuts and cross cuts respectively. You can, to an extent, interchange those. It's what they're best at and what you can use them for. The miter sled is a really great workaround. They have commercial ones, you can make them. I made mine. But it allows you to secure the piece. And I did a couple other bells and whistles on this one. I can do a video about it sometime if I haven't already. But I've started using this thing all the time just because it allows me to measure more accurately and clamp more accurately than my miter saw. But I love my miter saw. I also use it all the time because it's just very fast and easy to make a quick cut. You're not having to measure out your height and a lot of your other variables. So, what else can you do? Okay. So back to the table saw, a couple things that you can do is you can adjust this angle here. There's a wheel, it's not quite in camera, but you can tilt this angle of the blade very similar to a miter saw. So if you still need to make angled cuts as a rip cut, you can do that all here in the table saw too. So it also allows you to adjust the angle, and a lot of circular saws allow you to do the same thing, right? That's what this is here. So it's very common to be able to change your angle of cut across different saws. So that's pretty consistent. One of the cool things about a table saw is the ability to do dado cuts. Dado is when you have a blade stack. So this is one blade, and you can actually put a second blade, you can put spacers and chippers to increase the diameter of your blade. So while people do that, what a common thing to do is for shelving. This is just little plywood shelves, but I made dado cuts into the wood here, where you don't go all the way through. And people will do, depending on the shaft of your saw, of how many dado stacks you can do, how wide that diameter, how long that diameter is. You can actually make a kind of shelf for like a 1/4 inch piece of plywood in one cut. You can do the same thing without a dado stack, where you're just cutting a lot of parallel, cuts till you get your length width. But it's a lot more imprecise. It's a lot more difficult to do that. You'd have to do a lot more measurements. It's a lot more time. It's a lot more inconsistency. So a dado stack is like this, and it'll tell you what combination of pieces you need with chippers, spacers, and blades to hit certain diameters. People have done those things with routers too. You can do dado bits with routers. For me, having my crosscut sleds, having my fence, my measurement guide, I love doing on my table saw. My uncle uses his router set, but he has a better router table than I do. So again, it's whatever you feel comfortable with, being able to get those precise, reproducible results. But I use my dado stack on the table saw, which you can't really get with all the other saws. Like, you can't do that on this because you can't really adjust your height, right? If you're trying to get a consistent depth with your dado, you're just eyeballing this. But you can set your height and your measurement right here on the table saw. So that's a really good feature. If you don't need to cut all the way through a piece, if you need to do like a dado cut where you're cutting part of the way through, table saw is great for that. And you can't do that with a circular saw. So cuts that don't go all the way through, that you're making lines, grooves, anything like that, is kind of a unique feature of the table saw. There is something called a radial arm saw, which, as far as I can tell, were really popular in like the 80s, and no one uses them anymore because a lot of people lost fingers. And they really went out of style because of how dangerous they are. But they kind of combine both of these saws in some kind of weird hybrid. The radial arm saw, the blade moves similar to a circular saw, but it moves across the width. It's like a table saw. So it's like you lower and then push it. And so your piece of wood stays in the same area. It's just a really weird saw. I wouldn't recommend it. You don't. Maybe people that have used them safely, there's a unique feature or a unique trait. I think really anything you can do a lot safer, a lot easier with a table saw or a miter saw. You don't really see those around as much anymore. But the other thing is, I'm going to talk about some of the not specialty saws. Can you still see me over there? Let's get a little closer. So these are your big two. With table saw, miter saw, you're going to get 99% of everything you need to do. Like most basic geometry, squares that you're building, you can do with this. You can do miter cuts by hand. You can do everything by hand, right? So they sell miter block, which is it's like you can make one too, but it's a plastic block that holds your saw at a perfect 90-degree perpendicular angle to your piece of wood, allowing you to get a straight cut. So those are like plastic, and they're like $5. So you can replicate a lot of this stuff by hand if you need to. If you're looking for power tools, that gets you about there. Okay. So now these, if you want to do curves, right? Those are very good for straight cuts. What if you want to do angles, circles, curves? The bandsaw and the scroll saw are both very good at that. The bandsaw using a very small, thin blade, that's optional, right? You can change what kind of blade you put in it, but that's very common. You can curve your piece of wood around it. And the bandsaw this is a 10-inch, I don't know, 10-inch, anyway, and it has like a 30-inch band of teeth. And so your teeth if you look at a table saw, how many teeth you have, miter saw, table saw, if you look at how many teeth and how dull those can get, like your lifetime of this thing's having 3 or 4 times as many teeth spread out over a much larger circumference of the blade, allows it to be a lot more low power. These things are a little quieter, they're a little bit easier to work with. I love my little, I got this with you, Jay, actually at a garage sale. I bought this and the guy gave me a free hot dog. Anyway, you can do curved pieces, which is really nice for this. You can do the same thing with a scroll saw, which just has a blade that moves up and down or very thin. Again, you can change which blades you have. But this is a that's rusting a little bit. Or maybe that's just sawdust. Anyway, very thin detail work. People do with scroll saws. One of the cool things about scroll saws is you can disengage the blade. So people will make interior cuts. Well, they'll have a board and they'll drill a hole. They'll feed the little blade up the hole, and then you can cut in the interior piece. You can't do that with a bandsaw. It's a solid loop of metal. So that's one thing people can do. You have a little work surface. The other thing people use bandsaws for, not with a thin blade, but usually a thicker, deeper blade, is what they'll call resawing, which we talked about rip cuts, we talked about cross cuts. Now, resaw is when you're resawing the thickness of the board. So if you want to take a board like this and cut it right down the middle to make 2 boards the same size that are thinner, you wouldn't do this with this. This is crap MDF. But if you had a nice piece of fancy wood and you need a little sliver of it, something like that, or even they'll do it for logs. That's resawings when you have like a log and you're cutting it down into smaller pieces. But you can go through the width of the blade is what a resaw is. And people use a bandsaw for that because the blade is very thin. the diameter of the blade is called the kerf, and it's usually pretty large, relatively large for a table saw and a miter saw, being about 1/8 of an inch. So if you have a small chunk of wood that you're trying to make these cuts in over and over, these thin pieces, you can lose like 25 to 50% of the board to sawdust, to the kerf, which is just wasteful. So that's kind of the bandsaw being very thin and maneuverable. You can resaw and you can get taller up. Like if you look at the diameter of the very similar sized blades for the table and miter saw, you can only get about 3 to 4 inches up because of the height of it. That's the highest it will go. You really don't want, it's a lot of power to take a blade of that thickness through 4 inches of like a hard wood. So the bandsaw being a very much thinner blade, a very much longer blade, you can get a higher cut height. So that's why people will speed through these logs that can be 8 to 10 inches, 12, 14 inches tall. Thinner blade, less resistance, less heat, and these things are just powerful because they're spreading out that power over a much larger wheel using the power of the gear, basically, the gear ratios. You can get a lot of cutting power. Not with this one. This one's cheap old garbage. But I'm keeping this one for Kerrs, but people use larger, more industrial tools for resawing. But those are your 3 basic cuts, lengthwise, crosswise, and then depth-wise. And a jigsaw is basically the same thing as a scroll saw. You have a blade moving up and down, a little sawing pattern, handheld maneuverability, usually thicker blades than you have on a scroll saw. Scroll saw is usually a very fine, delicate blade for really detailed work. But again, moving the tool versus moving the workpiece. Those are your rudimentary overview for saws. People usually start with table and miter, and then if you're doing specific applications, scroll and band have their own advantages and features. But I hope this was informative, and I hope it wasn't 22 minutes long. But thanks for watching.